Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again as we finish up, actually, the book of First Samuel. We've been walking through this over the course of the last few months, and now we finally come to the conclusion of this book. And really, as we see the conclusion of this book, we really see the conclusion of Saul's reign as king and the beginning of David's reign as king. And so, as we look at these couple of chapters, really, I think what we're going to be seeing is we're going to continue to see God setting the stage for David to take the throne. And we talked about this a little bit during our actual in-person G3 event this past Thursday. And as we were doing that, we really did just kind of have this discussion on sometimes the Spirit is moving us even when we don't know it. And David is going to make some actions here that I think really do solidify his eventual ascension to the throne. And I'm not even sure that he's necessarily doing it thinking, oh, I'm going to be getting to the throne soon. I do think in some respects the Spirit is just moving him and preparing him for what God has in store. And what a tremendous reminder that is of the Spirit's work in our life, that promise that the Spirit continues to move us, the Spirit continues to guide us and shape us into the people of God we're meant to be. The Spirit continues to put us in situations where He needs us, where He's going to use us according to His will. That's a tremendous promise, and one that I think we should latch on to, and that I think we should remember as we read these last couple of chapters. When we finished up last week in 1 Samuel chapter 29, the Philistines had rejected David. They had sent him away. They hadn't wanted him to fight with them. And so this had been up at Aphek here, kind of in central Israel, northern Israel, up by the Sea of Galilee. So kind of central Israel. The Philistines are going to continue moving up to Shunem, up to that Jezreel Valley area where that battle of Gilboa is going to be fought. But David is sent back down to Ziklag, back down south, probably about 50 to 75 miles, somewhere in there. And we're going to read what happens next as David is sent home to Ziklag. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. I can only imagine kind of the fear that those soldiers, that David and his men had as they approached Ziklag. That smoke on the horizon before they could see their city, probably that first kind of set of nerves, that first anxiety. And then as they get closer, that sudden realization that, yes, this is our town, and then that race to get there. I'm sure they're just all racing to find their homes, to see what's left, to see if their family is alive, if they've survived, or if they're there. And as they look through the houses, they come to this realization that their families, instead of being killed, have been taken away. And I'm sure at first there's that image of relief. Oh, thank God they're still alive. And yet I can only imagine that it's promptly followed with despair. My wife, my kids are now captives of a foreign invading nation. What's going to happen to them? What kind of tortures, what kind of injustice are they going to endure now that they've been taken? And so we see them respond, I think, appropriately. When David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. This is probably indicative of kind of a ritual weeping, a ritual mourning. For me, I'm kind of picturing from the book of Jonah, we see that when Jonah speaks these words of law against Nineveh, the king himself tears his robes and dresses instead in sackcloth and sits in ashes and commands the whole city to do the same, the whole city to fast. We're probably seeing a similar level of kind of ritual fasting and mourning here with David and his men. They're weeping until they can't even weep anymore. And we see that David was not exempt from this. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul. each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And so David is filled with distress because not only is this great tragedy taking place, but now his men are blaming him. They're saying, oh, if we hadn't been up in Aphek fighting the Philistines battle, even though I think that David was going to have them turn on the Philistines. We talked about that last week as well. There's this great uproar. We should have been here protecting our families, and now they're gone. And David, it's your fault. How could you lead us into this mess, into this disaster, into this hardship for our families and for ourselves as we mourn them? And notice here a difference between David and Saul. In chapter 28, as we looked at Saul turning to a witch, turning to witchcraft to try to find answers, David strengthens himself in the Lord his God. Yes, he's concerned about the fact that his men want to kill him, but he knows where his strength is. He knows that his strength is in the Lord. And so David says to Abiathar the priest in verse 7, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. Notice here the firmness of God's response. There's this sense of surely. Yes, you're going to do it. And not only are you going to overtake them, not only are you going to rescue, but you shall surely overtake and you shall surely rescue. There's kind of this double confirmation that, yes, God is going to help David get success, win victory, and restore his standing with his people. And notice again, when Saul went looking for help, when Saul turned to the Lord for aid, it wasn't there. The Lord didn't answer. And yet here we see the Lord answering David. Certainly it's a reminder of the fact that God is the one who chooses. God is the one who delivers salvation. It's not about how good we are. It's not about who we are. It's about what God does for us. And yes, Saul made mistakes, but frankly, so does David. We know that. We're going to read that in 2 Samuel. We're going to read all about how David messes up. And yet God continues to provide salvation, continues to provide victory. And we see that again here with David. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Bezor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind who were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor. So over the last 3 days, David and his men have marched down, presumably with full battle attire, with swords and shields and armor. They've marched down from Aphek to Ziklag, about 50 miles, and now from Ziklag, they've traveled down to the Bezor brook. And some different translations will talk about like a ravine here, or a wadi. A wadi is what this technically is in Israel. Because of how the dry season and the rainy season work, what will happen in the wildernesses is that because the rain comes so suddenly and so fiercely, water will just rush through these creek beds, these ravines, and obviously as that erosion takes place, it just cuts it deeper and deeper. And so what's happening here is that in the dry season, this brook, Bezor Brook, is probably pretty dry. Probably not a whole lot there. If it's in the rainy season, it's probably a brook. So if you see ravine or wadi or brook, either way, it is all describing this kind of cut in the land. And actually, it's interesting. These cuts aren't typically dangerous, but in the rainy season, they're exceptionally dangerous just because of how torrential that rainfall, that water will come rushing down and it'd sweep you away. But it's probably in the dry season here as David gets to this brook. And again, 50 miles down to Ziklag, you can't really tell based off of this map, but it's probably another 10 to 15 miles down to this Bezor brook that probably marching overnight. They've gotten to their home, and immediately David does all this, and now they pick up their stuff again, and they travel down to the brook Bezor. They're ready for warfare again because they're trying to rescue their families, their kids, their wives, their servants, their stuff, their livestock. All of it's been taken. And as they do so, verse 10, but David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind who were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor. Certainly, it's reasonable to think that some of these men would have been tired. We're talking about a 60-ish mile march over a 3-day span. marching in the night now, trying to catch up. There's that anxiety, that fear, and 200 of the 600 men can't make it. They have to stop here. They can't crawl down this ravine and then climb back up the other side. It's not going to happen. And because it would take too much time to go around, they stop here at the brook Brazor. But David and 400 men pursue, and they're pursuing into the Negeb. They're pursuing further south into this wilderness of the Negeb. And as you look at this vast wilderness, I do want you to keep in mind then just the unlikeliness of what comes next. We again see God's hand at work here. Again, a reminder for us as God's people that God does work in our lives. This is Romans 8:28, right? God works everything according to his good. We can't always see it. We can't always understand why, and yet God is going to take this situation and work it to David's good. Verse 11, they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So for 3 days and 3 nights, this man has been stuck in the wilderness, without food, without drink. I'm sure we kind of recognize this. 3 days without water is about as long as you can go and survive. So this man is at the edge of death when David and his men find him. What do you think are the chances of finding this man who's probably unconscious, who certainly isn't being able to cry out when we get dehydrated, right? We can't speak. Certainly not crying out for help, certainly not able to cause a ruckus, probably unconscious. And as David and his men are trying to trace the Amalekites through this region, they stumble across this man. And notice David's care for him. They're in a hurry. They want to get going. But David stops and he cares for this man. Certainly, I call to mind here that story of the Good Samaritan, that parable. Certainly a reminder for us that in the busyness of life, and let's face it, oftentimes we're busy, maybe even overly busy. We probably have too much on our calendars. But we shouldn't let that stop us from doing good, from doing the right thing, from caring for the people that we come across in life. I would encourage you, if you ever have the opportunity to be late because you were helping someone, probably a good thing. It's okay. Lateness isn't good, but there's times where it's excusable. And here we see David feeds him, he cares for him, he gives him water, and the man's revived. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" He said, "I'm a young man of Egypt, servant to a Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago." Notice just the difference between David and the master of this servant. The master says, he's just a foreigner, he's an Egyptian, I don't need him, throw him away. He's sick, we're on this raid, we're trying to get out of Dodge, leave him. He falls behind, he stays behind. David, on the other hand, is desperately trying to catch up to his family, and instead of leaving this man behind, thinking of him as a burden, he cares for him. And again, certainly we see God's hand in all of this. The chances of finding someone laying in the dirt in this wilderness are slim to none, and yet God puts David exactly where he's supposed to be. Verse 14, the Egyptian servant continues, "We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Kerethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, 'Will you take me down to this band?' And the Egyptian said, 'Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band.'" So this servant knows that, he attacked Ziklag, right? He was part of that raid. He was part of the men that burnt down the home of David and his family and took them captive. And so in order to help him, he tries to ensure his own safety. Is this probably necessary? No, David's a class act. But maybe it is. And so he says, "Look, if you promise you won't kill me, and if you promise you won't turn me over as a traitor to my master, then I'm going to help you." Because the servant knows that if he goes back to his master as a traitor, he's a dead man. And he knows that he's supposedly going to be dead to rights by David. But he gets this assurance from David, and so he leads them to where the Amalekites are encamped. "And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah." And so we see here that the Amalekites are not engaged in kind of like a protective measures for their camp. They think that they've won a great victory, and they think there's no way that they could be caught now. They've journeyed back south into the Negeb, and as we look at the map, remember, they know that the Philistines and Israel are all journeying north to fight. They're heading to the Jezreel Valley. The fight's going to be up there. The Amalek, as you can see on the map, is a southern portion of the Canaanites, and so they've just snuck into these southern areas and they've won this great victory. They think that they're away scot-free. They think there's no one that can harm them. And so they're a nomadic tribe. They're in this wilderness with their livestock, with their herds, with all of the spoil of war that they've won. And they're celebrating. They're dancing. They're not keeping watch. They're not guarding themselves carefully. They think the victory's won. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And so here, typically when we think about twilight, we think about it as nighttime. What's being actually described here is that David attacks at the break of day, in that twilight, right? In that kind of half-light as the sun's about to come up. All of the Amalekites have been partying all night. They've been celebrating their victory. I'm sure they're groggy. I'm sure maybe some of them aren't in the most fit state. And so David senses that now is the appropriate time to attack. And notice how many people get away. It reads as if David has accomplished a rout. And I think that's what we're supposed to see. David has won a great victory here. He's struck down a pretty sizable army. He's won this battle handily. And yet still 400 Amalekites escape. And so I think we're supposed to see that 400 as a subset of a greater army. So the number of people who escape is the same number of troops that David starts with. David goes into this fight with 400 men and wins this great victory over an army that's clearly far superior in terms of strength. Again, we see God's hand at work here, God delivering salvation, just as God continues to deliver salvation to you and to me. This is the promise that God gives. This is why Reformation Day is coming up. This is why we sing that God is our mighty fortress, our strong deliverer. He is the one that protects us and cares for us and guards and keeps us. He's the one that's won for us eternal salvation. That's the promise that David trusted in. And we see God continue to provide for him even in this earthly life too. Just like God provides for us food, drink, house, home, land, animals, all that we need to support this body and life. David, verse 18, recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." And so those men who were ready to kill him, who were ready to stone David, now are rejoicing again and saying, "This is David's victory." They know who was faithful here. They know who faithfully followed after God and his will. They know that God gave this victory to David. It wasn't because of them. It was because of David and his faithfulness. And so they're now celebrating him again as leader. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. And so the author of Samuel here is very clearly showing us that David is treating these men with respect from the start. He greets them. And this is certainly a brotherly action, an action of a commander to his troops, acknowledging them, acknowledging their importance. But, verse 22, then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart." And so remember, David's army is largely composed of these kind of worthless fellows, right? This is how we see his army starting. He gathers to himself all those who are destitute, all the poor, all those who are discontented with the way things are in Israel, frankly, probably some criminals. His troop is kind of a motley crew, remember? And now we see that some of those members of his army are saying something that's frankly unright, unjust. They say to each other that these men who stayed behind at the brook Besor, remember 200 of the 600 stayed behind when they were too tired to carry on. those 200 men, they'll get their wives and kids. We'll give those back. Those are theirs. It's not right for us to take that, but their stuff, their livestock, anything else that the Amalekites took, they didn't fight for it. They didn't earn it. They don't deserve it. We're going to hold on to that. They can take their wives and their kids and go. We don't want them here. If they really wanted it, they would have kept going. They would have been tough like us. They would have been strong like us. But notice David's wisdom in this. Notice how David, again, we see this so often in his life, he eloquently rebukes and strengthens his army. Verse 23, but David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us." Notice where David places the victory. David doesn't say, "This is my victory, I get to decide what to do." He says, "This is the Lord's victory. The Lord gets to decide how we handle this." And the Lord wouldn't want this. Notice also how he addresses those worthless fellows as his brothers. His very first words are words of comfort, words of love, words of just saying, look, we're in this together. God has given us this victory, my brothers. Let's not do this. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Again, putting God first. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And so I'm almost picturing David here as like a coach, right? Inspiring his team, saying, look, we're only as strong as our weakest link. If our bench guys can't get it done, then we're not going to be able to get it done. We need people to be able to watch after the baggage. Not everyone can go out into the battle. This was a good and faithful work that they're doing. Notice how he lifts up these 200 that stay behind and puts them on the level of the 400 who won the fight. Really, David, I think, here is kind of expressing that idea of vocation that we cling to, that I think is such a rich part of our theology, this acknowledgement that no matter what job we're doing, if we're doing a job that is pleasing to God, and if we're doing it well, then we're caring for God's creation. We're living out our vocation. We're being those masks of God in how we operate. God is working through us in this world. And David is saying that right here. He's saying, look, you 400 who fought, yes, you were good and faithful, but so were these 200 who stayed behind, who guarded our baggage so that we could pursue quicker, so that we could overtake this band, so that God could give this victory into our hands. These men were part of that too. And so he makes this rule and says, hey, people who stay behind with the baggage, they get their fair share of the spoil, just as those who go to war. And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. So because we know what comes next in 2 Samuel, in the Hebrew, this is all one book. It's all one giant book. And we've decided to split it up, really, I think, into Saul's reign and then David's reign, like I kind of talked about at the start of this study. But whoever's writing this is doing so from that perspective of the end of 2 Samuel. They're saying that this rule that David sets in place is still in place at basically the end of his life, the start of Solomon's reign. And so we again see how faithful David is as a leader, his wisdom in this action. And we're going to see further wisdom here, because when David came to Ziklag, when he gets back home, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, and Ramoth of the Negeb, in Jatir, in Aror, in Siphmoth, in Eshtamoa, in Rakal, in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Borashan, in Athek, and Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. And so what David does, he gets back to Ziklag, and he sends out from that great victory he had. Remember, not only had they obtained their spoil, but presumably they had obtained whatever livestock, whatever other spoil the Amalekites had. And so he takes from that victory and he sends it off to different cities. You can see some of them listed here. We're not 100% sure on where these all are archaeologically, but Aror, Hormah, Ramoth, Jatir, Eshtamoa, Hebron, Borashan. He sends these out to the leaders of Judah, to his tribe. And really, I think we see this kind of paving that way, making smooth his way to the throne, because now when he takes the throne, these people are going to remember, hey, David is the guy that won a victory and cared for us. He looked after us in all of this. And at least in some respect, maybe there's an image of repayment here verse 31 in Hebron for all the places where David and his men had roamed. Perhaps he had gathered up some crops or some food or been given supplies from people in these towns. And yet we don't see that anywhere else in 1 Samuel. I mean, the only other time he asked for supplies, right? Nabal says no. And he's about to go to war until Abigail brings him out supplies. So it's possible that here David really is just being generous and just offering up this bounty, this victory for the people of Israel. And again, what a brilliant maneuver this is as David gets closer to taking the throne. And I don't know if he has a plan or if this is just the Spirit working through him. I'm inclined to think the latter, that the Spirit is just guiding his actions here without David being 100% certain of the outcome. But the Spirit is encouraging David to live out that life of a Christian, of a follower of Yahweh, of a follower of God. That fruit of the Spirit, that generosity, that patience, that kindness, that goodness, it's flowing out of him because that's just what the Spirit does. And the results are going to work out well for David. But now we've been down south for the most part in this. We've been in Ziklag and down south into the Negeb wilderness. Now we're going to move back north to Jezreel, to the Jezreel Valley, to Shunem, to Mount Gilboa. And we talked about this as we talked about 1 Samuel chapter 28. We saw this described that the Philistines gather at Shunem and the Israelites gather at Jezreel. And they're encamped the Israelites gather on Mount Gilboa, overlooking this valley of Jezreel. And as they're preparing for war, Saul sneaks off to Endor, meets this witch, and hears that he's going to be killed the next day in battle. And we're picking up his story here then after he's received this bad news. And chapter 31, verse 1, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. So in battle, they would have gone down into the valley, into this Jezreel valley. Mount Gilboa is right here. You can see it. And the Philistines with their chariots have just routed the Israelites, and they're chasing them. And the Israelites are fleeing up Mount Gilboa. They're fleeing away from those chariots. Obviously, it's hard to pull a chariot uphill. It doesn't work very well. And so they're fleeing, just trying to get away, but still the Philistines, their infantry, their ground troops are following after them, and they're just destroying them, cutting them down on this mountain. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchi-Shua, the sons of Saul. So Saul has seen his sons be killed. And the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. So archers are shooting up into the Israelite ranks, and Saul gets hit. He's wounded. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And so here at the last we see, frankly, another example of Saul's unfaithfulness. We see Saul commit suicide. And yet, while this is a sin, it isn't a sin that is unforgivable. I don't want anyone to have that misunderstanding. Some people have taken 1 John. If I turn to 1 John chapter 5 really quickly, if you'll bear with me. John is talking about sin. And he's talking about praying for sin and how we should be praying for sin, but some sin you just can't fix. And so in 1 John chapter 5, he says, give me just a second here. Okay. Chapter 5, verse 16, if anyone sees his brother committing a sin not leading to death, he shall ask, and God will give him life. To those who commit sins that do not lead to death. There is sin that leads to death. I do not say that one should pray for that. All wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that does not lead to death. John here is talking about this sin that leads to death and saying, hey, you can't pray for that. Some Christians have taken that to talk about suicide and say, well, if you commit suicide, it's kind of one last act that God can't forgive. You've committed this sin at the end of your life. You can't receive forgiveness. But that's not actually what John is talking about. John, whenever he's talking about life and death, he's talking about belief and unbelief. And you can really see this throughout his gospel, throughout his epistles. And so what John is saying here is, look, You can pray for your brother and sister to stop sinning, to be removed from that sin. And frankly, he is saying, I think, you can even pray for them in their unbelief. But no matter how much you pray for it, no matter how much you pray for God's mercy in that regard, that's a sin that leads to death. And unless belief happens, unless belief is there, you can't receive salvation. And I think it is wrong-headed to suggest that everyone who commits suicide, well, by nature, they're not believing there. They're not trusting in God. That would be like saying if I'm driving home today and a semi comes across the median and is barreling down towards me, and I swear, I curse, and die. That's the next thing that happens. That I can't enter into heaven. I just think that God's forgiveness is stronger than that. The power of Christ on the cross is stronger than my sinfulness. The belief, the trust that we had in God because of the work of his Spirit, that is what brings us salvation, not our perfect living. And so I think what John is saying here then is based around that unbelief. And so while Saul did many things wrong, I do also think he did trust in the Lord. I do think he trusted that Yahweh was the Lord, that Yahweh was God, and that he was going to send a Messiah. And frankly, that's all we need for salvation. Now, I don't get to make the decisions. Half jokingly, half seriously, we talked about that, how it's actually good that God is the one who determines what is just, because his justice is so much richer than our justice, our sense of right and wrong. But frankly, God has said that if you believe and trust in him, you will receive everlasting life. And so I think we will see Saul in heaven one day, that when Christ returns and raises us from the dead, Saul will be numbered among us. But I don't know for sure. And certainly at the end of his life, while I can sympathize with this decision, if he's captured by the Philistines, he's going to be tortured. He's going to be humiliated. He's going to be mocked. He's going to endure a great deal of suffering, and no one wants to do that. I can understand why taking his life on his terms feels like the better decision. That's not what God wants for his people. God is the one who gives life, and it's God who takes away life. And we should trust him in that regard. And Saul does not here at the end of his life. And verse 5, and when his armor-bearers saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So while the armor-bearer could not bring himself to kill Saul, the Lord's anointed, he could, and I think that's right, he shouldn't have. It's certainly reflective of what David says, where David says, I'm not going to strike down the Lord's anointed. He also takes his own life. And again, we see the tragedy of this. Again, his life would have been forfeit, whether he was captured by the Philistines or whether he's captured by the Israelites or returns safely from the battle. Most armor bearers, if the person they were supposed to be protecting dies, their life is forfeit. So rather than enduring that humiliation, he also kills himself. And again, wrongful, but I can sympathize. I can understand where our sinful hearts would be led in that direction. And certainly that forgiveness of Christ is stronger than our sin, even here. At verse 6, thus Saul died, and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men on the same day together. And so we see just how brutal this defeat is at Mount Gilboa. Verse 7, and when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. And so we kind of see, actually, going back full circle to what happened prior to Saul's reign. When we first see Saul kind of taking the throne, Saul is hiding in caves because of the might of the Philistines. It's Jonathan that kind of propels Israel out of the caves and helps them reclaim the land, the cities that are theirs. But now that Saul has died, now that the king is dead, we see the Philistines return to those, and we see Israel again fleeing to the hills, to the caves, cowering in fear. In verse 8, the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And so they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. Certainly this should be disheartening for us to see just kind of the weight of human evil, of human sin. these Philistines take Saul, they desecrate his body, they humiliate him even in death, and they send this good news, this gospel of someone's death to their brothers and sisters. Certainly, this is not how we should respond to the death, frankly, of anyone. We should mourn even those people who are sinful and die, because now they have died and they don't have that hope of salvation in Christ. Death is a tragedy, one that we should mourn in all times and in all places. Verse 10, they put his armor in the Temple of Asteroth, and they fastened his body to the Wall of Bethshan. And so Bethshan is a city. We've talked about this a little bit when we talk about archaeology. This is kind of the ruins of Bethshan, of this tell of this city. And you can actually see here these columns are Roman columns. And so the Romans came here and they had built a city on top of it. But if you dive down deep enough, you can actually see that there's probably 15 layers of cities. And we can think about this with Ziklag, right? Ziklag gets burned to the ground at the start of chapter 30. And when it does so, David and his men come back and they rebuild on top of it. Cities get destroyed all the time in this ancient world. And that's what you do. You build on top of the previous city. And so if you actually go to Bethshan and you dig down deep enough, you can find out that there's probably about 15 layers of cities. The city has been destroyed and rebuilt 15 times, with finally this kind of Roman city being the last one built on top. And in fact, as they talk about fastening to the temple, we've dug down and we think that we've found basically a temple, a Philistine temple here at Bethshan. And obviously, this is not what it looks like. This is a recreation of what it would have looked like. But you can almost picture Saul's body being hung kind of here at the front. And this is probably superstition related. It's a way, again, of humiliating that corpse, humiliating that person, even in death. The hanging also kind of keeps them from a peaceful rest. It protects the Philistines from any vengeful spirits, because that body, that soul, can't find rest as it's hanging in the temple of its enemy. And certainly, again, just a vivid, gross reminder of our sinfulness. But when the inhabitants of Yabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And they came to Yabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree and fasted 7 days. And so here at the close of 1 Samuel, as we end Saul's life, the story of his life, these men from Yabesh Gilead, they hear what's happened, and so they journey up to Bethshan, and they fight their way there, I'm sure, and they steal the body back, and they take it back to Yabesh Gilead, and they bury it there under this tamarisk tree. And as you can see here, Bethshan is an Israelite city, and yet it's occupied by the Philistines at this time. The fact that they have a temple there suggests that it's been occupied for a while. It's just to the east in that Jezreel Valley. And so Mount Gilboa, Shunem, Jezreel, they're all kind of over here. It's probably about 10-ish miles east of that fight. So that's where the Philistines take the body and are displaying it. And these faithful men of Yabesh come up and they save this servant of the Lord from this final humiliation, and they come back and they bury him. And I find it interesting that this takes actually Saul's body back to that first part of his reign. If you'll recall, Saul's first victory is saving the citizens of Yabesh Gilead. They are being oppressed and they're under siege, and they send out a request for aid, and Saul musters the armies of Israel, and he comes and he wins a great battle for these citizens of Yabesh Gilead. He saves them from destruction. And I find it interesting that this is where Saul is buried. And if we take our theology of the resurrection seriously, then this is where Saul is going to be raised. This is where Saul is one day going to be knit back together, where Christ is going to raise him from the dead and bring him into his kingdom. And I think it's fitting that at the site of really his greatest victory, one day that King Saul, who is unfaithful in so many different ways, will rise again and be the faithful king that he was meant to be. It's the promise that you and I have been given too, that even though we continue to fall, even though we continue to fall short, Christ didn't. Christ has won this victory for us over sin, over the devil, over even death itself. And one day soon, he will gather us to himself. He will raise all who have been departed, all who have died, who have tasted death, and will bring us into everlasting life, where we will reign for all eternity. Praise God for that victory of Christ. And praise God that even in the midst of our failures, just like Saul, he continues to see fit to show us his grace and mercy. May God bless you this day. And next week, we'll start up looking at 2 Samuel. And when I say next week, I mean in the start of November. That first week of November is when our next G3 study will be held. I hope you can join us, and I certainly hope that you'll continue to be caught up in those promises of Christ. Bye.